The jazz music in the restaurant was too frantic, all sharp brass and unpredictable tempo. But what caught my attention was the silver watch resting on the black marble table. The setting was pure downtown Denver dim lighting, overpriced minimalist food, the smell of expensive cologne and roasted garlic hanging heavy in the air. I pulled at the collar of my suit, feeling like a fence post painted to look like a marble column. Philip, my boss at the crisis management firm, had insisted on this blind date, promising me the woman was a high-powered executive who needed some grounding. I slid into the leather booth, glancing at the woman already seated across from me, and the air completely left my lungs. She was looking down at a menu, her dark hair pinned back in that exact, no-nonsense twist I remembered from 3 years ago. The silver watch with the scratched face, the one her grandfather gave her, caught the ambient light from the table candle. It was a rugged, practical object in a room full of delicate, useless things. "I'm going to tell you right now," she said, her voice carrying that familiar, crisp authority, without her looking up from the wine list. "I only agreed to this because Philip is handling our firm's mediation tomorrow, and he wouldn't stop pestering me. I have about 45 minutes before I need to review a quarterly report." I set my water glass down. The ice clinked heavily against the crystal. I leaned back against the leather booth, folding my hands on the table. "Well," I said, my voice dropping into its natural, slower rhythm, "I suppose that gives us 44 minutes to figure out how we're going to tell Philip he just set me up with my ex-wife?" Margaret Clark finally looked up. Her posture stiffened, the menu slipping a fraction of an inch in her grip. I saw the sudden tension in her jaw, the way her shoulders locked into a rigid line. 3 years hadn't changed the sharp intelligence in her expression, nor the fact that she looked completely out of my league, a city falcon forced to sit across from a field dog. I kept my face steady, not offering a polite smile, just a calm acknowledgement of the disaster unfolding. "Raylan," she said. The word was a flat exhalation, devoid of the anger I might have expected, holding only a weary kind of disbelief. "Evening, Margaret." I picked up my napkin and unfolded it slowly, giving her time to process. "You're looking well. A bit tired around the eyes? Maybe, but the city seems to be treating you fine." She set the menu down, her fingers pressing flat against the cold marble. "Philip said he had a new senior negotiator, someone who specialized in de-escalation and behavioral analysis. He said your name was Gray." "It is. Raylan Gray." I watched the realization click behind her dark eyes. I dropped my middle name professionally when I moved out here from the county. Folks out here seem to trust a simple name more. She picked up her water glass, her hand perfectly steady, though I noticed the slight whitening of her knuckles. Our divorce hadn't been an explosive affair. It had been a quiet, grinding erosion of trust. She was built for skyscrapers and quarterly earnings. I was built for wide-open spaces and the quiet hum of a tractor engine. I had tried to fit into her world, and she had tried to slow down for mine, but the friction had eventually worn through the hull. "I cannot believe this," she murmured, glancing toward the restaurant's entrance as if plotting an immediate exit strategy. "I don't have time for a cosmic joke right now, Raylan. My company is in the middle of a hostile restructure." Before I could offer her a graceful way to leave, a shadow fell over our table. "Margaret, I thought I saw you." I looked up. The man standing there wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than my first truck. He had a tight, polished smile that didn't reach his eyes. I didn't need a psychological dossier to read his body language. He was leaning into her space, asserting dominance, his chin tilted up. "Ian?" Margaret said. Her voice dropped 10 degrees, the warmth entirely drained from it. "I'm in the middle of a dinner." "Of course," Ian Hill said smoothly, sparing me a brief, dismissive glance. "I just wanted to remind you about the board meeting tomorrow morning. The new partnership contract clauses are finalized. I'm sure you've reviewed the performance stipulations." He paused, adjusting his cuffs, letting the threat hang in the air like smoke. "It would be a shame if the board felt your recent distractions made you a liability to the merger." He was aiming for her throat, using professional jargon to mask the blade. Margaret's jaw tightened. I watched her hand move toward her phone, a defensive reflex to pull up her schedule or call security. I didn't think. I just acted. I shifted my weight, putting my forearms on the table, and looked up at Ian. I didn't raise my voice. In my line of work, the quieter you get, the more people have to lean in to listen. "Excuse me, Ian, was it?" I asked, my drawl a little thicker, a little more deliberate. Ian blinked, looking at me properly for the first time. "Yes." "And you are?" "I'm the man trying to enjoy a meal," I said evenly. Now, where I come from, interrupting a conversation to deliver a threat disguised as a friendly reminder is considered poor manners. I'm sure whatever paperwork you're fretting over will still be there tomorrow when the sun comes up. Ian's polished smile faltered, a flash of genuine annoyance breaking his facade. "This is internal company business. And this," I gestured to the space between Margaret and me, "is a private table. You've said your piece. Have a good evening." I held his gaze. I didn't glare. I just offered a flat, immovable wall of calm. In crisis negotiation, you never match the aggressor's energy. You absorb it and give back a void. Ian stood there for 3 long seconds, his ego warring with the public setting. Finally, he gave a curt nod to Margaret and walked away toward the bar. Margaret let out a breath, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. She looked at me, a complex mixture of relief and guardedness in her expression. "He's the VP trying to force my buyout," she said quietly. "I figured," I replied, signaling the waiter for the check. "Seems to me you need that negotiator Philip promised you." The snow started falling thick and heavy as we stepped out of the restaurant, coating the Denver sidewalks in a slick, dangerous layer of white. The temperature had plummeted, the kind of biting cold that felt like a physical weight against the chest. Margaret stood under the canvas awning, pulling her wool coat tighter around her frame. "My car is parked 3 blocks away," she said, her breath pluming in the icy air. "And the valet here is backed up for 20 minutes. I took the train," I admitted, my hands buried deep in my pockets. "But the lines are frozen over. Dispatch just announced a delay on the overhead monitor. It's a logistics nightmare." She looked up at the sky, watching the heavy flakes gather on the traffic lights. Philip's team could litigate, but litigation would take weeks. Ian only needs 1 vote tomorrow morning to execute the performance clause and seize the division. "And you're Philip's new lead." The air between us felt heavy with consequence, a problem much larger than awkward history. I didn't reach out to touch her arm. I stepped into the wind, placing myself between her and the draft coming down the street. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was just practical instinct. "I reckon that means we have to share a cab," I said, a slow smile touching the corners of my mouth as a yellow taxi slowed near the curb. I stepped out, opening the back door and gesturing for her to get in and figure out how to work together before sunrise. She got in, sliding across the worn leather seat. I followed, shutting the door against the cold. The heater in the cab was broken on one side, blasting tepid air at our knees while the windows frosted over. I rolled my shoulders to ease the tension in my suit jacket. "Ian found a loophole in the original partnership contract," Margaret said, looking out the fogged window at the passing city lights. "It activates if my division falls behind a specific metric for 2 consecutive quarters, which he engineered." I listened, letting the silence stretch between her sentences. "And Philip assigned me to mediate the renegotiation." "Yes." She turned to look at me, the street lamps painting bright stripes across her face. "I'm supposed to trust my entire legacy to a man who couldn't stay in my world for more than 2 years. My jaw tightened. I pressed my thumb hard against the brass latch of my briefcase, counting my breaths until my voice stayed level. I didn't snap back or defend myself. That was the past. I was here for the present. I leaned my elbows on my knees, looking straight ahead at the plastic partition. "Margaret, I'm here to do a job. I read contracts the way my father read weather patterns. If there's a storm coming in that paperwork tomorrow, I'll find a way to break it. I don't need you to trust me with your heart. I just need you to trust my eyes." She stared at me, searching my face for the familiar avoidance, the old habit of retreating when things got too complicated. But I held her gaze, offering nothing but a steady, immovable promise. "Fine," she said softly, turning back to the window. We started 8 a.m. The conference room the next morning was a sterile expanse of glass, chrome, and aggressive air conditioning. The kind of room that made me feel like I was breathing recycled panic. Margaret sat at the head of the long table, her posture perfect, a thick legal file resting under her hands. I sat to her right, wearing a simpler gray suit, rolling a cheap ballpoint pen between my fingers. Ian sat across from us, flanked by two lawyers whose suits looked identical to his. He opened his leather-bound folder with a loud snap, a theatrical move meant to signal power. "Let's make this quick," Ian said, his voice bouncing off the hard surfaces. "The metrics are clear. The partnership contract stipulates an automatic structural shift. The mediation here is simply to formalize the transition of her shares." I didn't speak immediately. I let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds. I set my pen down. It made a small tap against the glass table. Every eye in the room moved to the pen. "Mr. Gray," one of the lawyers said, sounding impatient, "do you have an opening statement on behalf of the firm?" I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. "I suppose I do." My voice was a slow drawl, quiet enough that the room had to settle to hear me. Back where I grew up, we had a saying about putting up a new fence. If you build it fast in the dark, you're going to spend the next 10 years fixing it in the daylight. Ian sighed heavily, an exaggerated display of annoyance. "I don't see what agricultural anecdotes have to do with corporate restructuring." I smiled, a thin, polite curve of the lips. "It means, Ian, that I read the original contract last night. The one you cited for this transition." I slid a single sheet of paper across the glass table. It spun slowly and stopped directly in front of Ian. Clause 4. B states that the metrics for growth are calculated based on operational output, barring any— I paused, letting the word hang, force majeure, or systemic supply disruption initiated by the primary vendor, which, according to the shipping logs from August, your department handled exclusively. The room went completely silent. The hum of the air conditioning suddenly seemed very loud. "I don't know what you're implying," Ian said, his voice tightening. "I'm not implying anything," I said calmly. "I'm stating a fact. You held back the supply chain deliveries to her division to manufacture the metric failure. The contract you're trying to enforce is invalid due to internal sabotage. We aren't here to formalize a transition. We're here to talk about how you're going to step down from the board to avoid a lawsuit." Ian's face flushed a dark, angry red. He stood up, placing both hands flat on the table, trying to loom over me. I stayed seated. I didn't flinch. I just looked up at him with the detached curiosity of a man watching a tractor get stuck in deep mud. "This is ridiculous," Ian snapped, turning to Margaret. "You're letting this consultant dictate the terms of our company?" Margaret didn't blink. She picked up the file under her hands, tapping it once against the glass. "Actually, Ian," she said, her voice a cool blade of steel, "he just saved me the trouble of explaining it to you myself. And if you raise your voice in my boardroom again, I'll have security escort you out." The tension in the office didn't evaporate after the meeting, but the immediate threat had been stalled. Ian and his lawyers had retreated to review the findings, which meant they were scrambling for a defense they didn't have. Margaret and I were left alone in the vast, quiet space. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. I stayed by the table, gathering my papers and sliding them neatly into my briefcase. "You found that clause in less than 12 hours, Margaret said, her reflection in the glass looking tired. "It's just words," I replied simply. "Folks in this town try to hide things behind complicated sentences. You just have to follow the trail of what they're trying not to say." She turned around, leaning against the cold glass. Her hand went to her temple, 2 fingers pressing against a persistent headache. I recognized the tell instantly. It was the same gesture she made when she was overwhelmed, the same quiet pressure she applied when the noise of her life got too loud. I opened my briefcase again and pulled out a small glass jar, setting it on the edge of the table. It was wrapped in a simple cloth, secured with a piece of twine. Beside it, I placed a small, thick slice of homemade bread wrapped in wax paper. "My sister sent up a batch of peach preserves from the farm last week," I said casually, snapping the briefcase shut. "Thought you might want something that didn't come out of a plastic wrapper. You didn't touch your breakfast." Margaret stared at the jar. The contrast of the rustic, simple food against the sleek, modern boardroom table was stark. She walked slowly over to the table, her eyes fixed on the jar. She untied the twine, her fingers brushing the cloth. "You remembered," she whispered. "I remember most things, Margaret," I said quietly. "Even the things I shouldn't." I turned toward the door, giving her the privacy to eat, to let the tension bleed out of her shoulders without having to perform strength for an audience. 2 days later, the quiet collapsed into chaos. A secondary logistics vendor, spooked by an email Ian had deliberately leaked about the restructure, called Margaret's direct line threatening to cancel their transport contract entirely. Losing them would freeze operations in 3 states by nightfall. Margaret was on the phone, pacing the length of her office, her voice sharp and defensive, but the vendor was yelling loud enough that I could hear the static from across the room. I walked over, tapped the mute button on her console, and picked up the receiver. "Mr. Davies," I said, pitching my voice low, erasing all urgency from the line. "This is Raylan Gray, lead mediator on the restructure. I understand you received an unauthorized email regarding operational transitions." The vendor stopped yelling. "Who is this? I need a guarantee my trucks aren't driving for a bankrupt division." "I'm looking at the company ledger right now," I said calmly, tracing a finger over a printed balance sheet I had audited that morning. "The division has $40 million in liquid reserve." Ian Hill's email was a breach of protocol, not a statement of fact. "If you pull your trucks today, you violate Section 7 of your service agreement, and we will replace you by tomorrow morning. If you hold the line, your quarterly bonus clears on Friday. It's just a lot of noise, Mr. Davies. Don't let someone else's panic cost you your payout." There was a long silence on the line. Then, a heavy sigh. "All right. The trucks roll. But I want a written confirmation by noon." "You'll have it by 11, I promised, and hung up. Margaret was staring at me from behind her desk. She sank into her leather chair, typing furiously to draft the confirmation email. The central AC kicked on, dropping the room's temperature by several degrees. Margaret shivered slightly, rubbing her arms through her thin blouse, but didn't stop typing. I didn't say a word. I walked over to the digital thermostat on the wall, pressed the up arrow, and raised the heat to 70 degrees. Then I walked back to my spot on the sofa, picking up my document without breaking my reading rhythm. A moment later, I heard the typing stop. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft in the quiet room. "Don't mention it," I mumbled, flipping a page. "You used to do that," she noted, turning her chair slightly toward me. "Adjust the environment before I even had to ask. The heater in the truck, the lights in the kitchen, it's just observation," I deflected, keeping my eyes on the paper. "No, it's care," she corrected, leaning back. "Something I didn't appreciate enough when we were married. I was always so focused on the next crisis. I thought your slowness was a lack of ambition." I lowered the document. "I'm not built for speed, Margaret. I'm built for endurance. You wanted a racehorse, and you married a draft animal. That's not fair," she said softly. She stood up, walking slowly toward the sofa. She stopped a few feet away, respecting the physical boundary between us. "I didn't want a racehorse. I wanted someone who wouldn't look at my world and constantly judge it for being too loud." "I never asked you to apologize," I said, my voice quiet, defensive. "You didn't have to," she countered gently. "You just looked at the city like it was a trap, and I felt like I was the one holding the cage door shut." The hum of the servers seemed to fill the quiet. I stared at the blinking cursor on her screen, the weight of my past failures pressing flat against my ribs. She was right. Instead of helping her carry the load, I had pulled away, waiting for her to slow down. I was wrong, I said, looking up at her. I thought protecting myself meant keeping my distance. I should have stood beside you, even if the noise gave me a headache. Margaret's eyes softened. She took a half step closer. I kept my hands firmly planted on my knees, refusing to reach out, locking my muscles tight. You're standing beside me now, Raylan, she said quietly. The fragile peace shattered the next morning. I walked into the office carrying 2 cups of black coffee, only to find Margaret standing by the window, her face pale, a piece of heavy stock paper trembling in her hand. Philip was standing near the door, looking grave. What happened? I asked, setting the coffees down instantly. Ian's legal team filed an injunction overnight, Philip explained, his voice tight. They found a hidden clause in a secondary vendor agreement from 5 years ago. It essentially states that if the company undergoes mediation for structural failure, all executive voting rights are suspended immediately, pending a full board review. It means I can't vote against the buyout, Margaret whispered, her voice cracking. They outmaneuvered us. By the time we fight the injunction in court, the merger will be pushed through. I've lost it, Raylan. I've lost the company. The air in the room felt thin, panicked. I looked at Philip, then at Margaret. I walked over to her. I took the heavy stock paper from her trembling hand and read it. They filed this at midnight, I noted, my voice dropping into that deep, slow register of absolute calm, trying to catch us sleeping. It's over, she said, wrapping her arms around herself. No, it's not, I replied, turning to Philip. This injunction requires a unanimous board vote to initiate the suspension. Ian has the board, Margaret said, shaking her head. He has most of them, I corrected, looking at the names at the bottom of the document. But he doesn't have the primary vendor's proxy vote, because I didn't wait for Ian's lawyers to find a back door. I spent 3 hours on the phone with the vendor's CEO yesterday. Margaret looked up, her eyes wide with sudden shock. You spoke to the vendor? I'm a negotiator, Margaret, I said softly, holding her gaze. I don't wait for the fire to reach the house. I go out and wet the grass. I pulled my phone from my pocket and handed it to her. Their general counsel emailed the signed statement and proxy withdrawal, copy to the board secretary, timestamped at 11:58 p.m. It's on the official ledger. Margaret looked from the phone to me, a slow, dawning realization washing over her face. She took a deep breath, the panic leaving her body, replaced by a sudden, fierce stability. Thank you, she whispered, handing the phone back to me. We still have to prove it to the board, I reminded her, keeping my voice steady. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., we walk in there and we end this. I stood in my dark kitchen later that night, the quiet pressing in so hard it rang in my ears. The adrenaline of the day had faded. Tomorrow, when the dust settled and Ian was gone, she would go back to her high-rise life, and I would go back to my quiet, solitary existence. I pulled out my phone, typed a text to Philip, stepping down from the final meeting to preserve her optics, hovered over send, then erased it, one letter at a time, until the screen went blank. I set the phone face down on the cold granite. I walked into the bedroom, pulled my dark suit from the closet, and laid it across the back of the chair. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. and turned off the light. The boardroom was packed the next morning. Ian sat at the head of the table, flanked by the board members he had rallied, looking smug and victorious. Margaret sat opposite him, her posture flawless, wearing a dark blue suit that looked like armor. I stood near the back, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, projecting nothing but absolute stillness. Ian opened the meeting with a sweeping gesture. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to execute the suspension clause and formalize the merger. He looked at Margaret, expecting a fight. She didn't argue. She calmly opened a sleek black folder and extracted a single, heavily documented packet. She didn't look at me, but I saw the slight, steadying breath she took before she spoke. "There will be no suspension," Margaret said, her voice ringing clear and authoritative across the long table. "Because the clause is invalid." She slid the packet down the table. It stopped squarely in front of the board chairman. "Inside that packet are the unaltered shipping logs from our primary vendor, alongside a sworn, signed affidavit from their CEO," she continued. Her eyes locked on Ian. "Furthermore, as verified by the board secretary last night, the vendor has officially withdrawn their proxy vote for this merger. This board does not have the unanimous consent required to suspend my voting rights." She stood up, placing both hands flat on the table, owning the room completely. "This merger is dead," she announced. "And I am formally requesting a board vote to remove Ian Hill from his position as vice president, effective immediately, pending a legal investigation for corporate sabotage." The silence in the room was absolute. Ian looked around, realizing he was surrounded by people rapidly calculating the cost of associating with him. He had lost. Margaret looked past him, her eyes finding mine at the back of the room. I gave her a single, slow nod of respect. 2 hours later, the fallout was handled. Ian was escorted from the building. We stood in the lobby, the afternoon sun breaking through the winter clouds, casting long, golden rays across the marble floor. People hurried past us, caught up in the current of the city, but we stood still in our own quiet pocket of space. "You didn't lead the meeting," she noted, turning to face me. "You didn't need me to," I replied simply. "You're the CEO, Margaret. I just cleared the brush so you could see the path." She smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached her eyes. "Philip offered to keep you on retainer for the firm." "I told Philip my job here is done," I said, my voice steady. I adjusted my briefcase strap and took a step toward the revolving doors. I was choosing the clean exit, leaving before I could complicate her victory. "Raylan." Her voice stopped me. I turned back. Margaret didn't hesitate. She closed the distance between us, stepping right into my personal space, ignoring the lobby traffic. She didn't ask a question. She simply reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were warm, slotting perfectly between mine. The contact sent a jolt of pure, grounded reality straight to my chest. I looked down at our joined hands, then up at her face. "I don't want momentum," Margaret said, her voice quiet, fierce, and certain. "I want an anchor. I want a man who knows how to lower the temperature in the room. I want the man who brings me homemade preserves and turns up the heat when I'm cold." She squeezed my hand, a public, undeniable claim. "I choose you, Raylan. I'm choosing us. And this time, I'm not asking you to change your pace. I'm asking you to walk beside me." I looked at the woman who commanded boardrooms and faced down saboteurs, standing here in the middle of a Denver high-rise lobby, anchoring herself to me. I tightened my grip on her hand, stepping closer to shield her from the rush of people passing by. "All right, Margaret," I said softly, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face. "Let's go home." I learned that real partnership isn't about grand speeches. It's about paying attention. It's noticing the cold and turning up the thermostat, remembering the peach preserves, and simply showing up when the room gets too loud. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.